This is Season 1, Episode 9 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Modern Gaming versus Old School, or The Decline of the 10-Foot Pole. Welcome to Mastering the RPG, as I said, a tabletop RPG podcast with advice, ideas, cool stuff found, and some opinions. And some of them are strong. We hope you get something out of it. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and James. You can find all the information about the show and our hosts at masteringtherepg.com. That's all one word. And if you want to send us some email, give us some feedback, ask us to adjudicate some questions, send us an email at gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. That's also all one word. So, hey, guys, good to see you. Great to get together again.
G'day.
Yeah. Good to have James back.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Good to be back.
Now, we have something very special. Instead of jumping into a cool stuff sound, we actually had a question come to us through Twitter from Daddy Dungeon Master. And thank you for saying you're a big fan. That's great. But the big question was, how could you adapt Call of Cthulhu to Savage Worlds, the sanity mechanic? And question, answers, question, answers. Maybe use that in Savage Worlds. So we've got James, who knows all about Call of Cthulhu, and there's also, Eric will talk a little bit about, there's already something in Savage World. So, hey, James, tell us a little bit about that sanity mechanic in Call of Cthulhu and how it might work.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks, Daddy Dungeon Master. So, looking at adapting Call of Cthulhu, particularly the sanity mechanic, to Savage Worlds. Okay, Call of Cthulhu, fantastic game. Really, really cool. If you haven't tried it, go play it now because it's really good. Is a percentage-based skill horror game where basically you have a big long list of skills, and one of those abilities or skills is sanity. The difference, I guess, between Call of Cthulhu and other role-playing games is this heavy sanity thing. Basically, what happens every time that you encounter something horrific, either a monster or a body or something untoward, you would make a roll called a sanity check. It's a percentage-based roll, and it is not only a roll, but it's also a pool of energy, similar to a hit points or a magic points. So if you fail that roll, you'll lose sanity, and you'll lose out of that pool of sanity, and essentially as the game progresses, the more sanity that you lose, the more likely it is that you'll have a psychotic attack or some kind of mental trauma that can affect you during the game, in that it can take you out of the game for about a minute if you're in combat, or it can take you out of the game for about an hour if you're out of combat. So it's a dwindling resource that you roll against if you see something terrible. And if something terrible happens often enough, then you'll have debilitating interactions with the game for a short period of time. The other thing is as that pool dwindles, then and in the longer term, it makes it more and more difficult to resist things that might send you insane. So there's an accumulation here. There's a snowballing effect in terms of Call of Cthulhu. Was that clear enough? It's a tricky thing explaining rules verbally, but I guess the biggest thing about sanity within Call of Cthulhu is how big an issue it is within the game. So it's not just a little thing that you add on. It's actually a very significant part of that game.
And it's like a domino effect, right? And that's the big part, is that once you're getting worse, it just makes it harder and harder.
Yeah, correct. So once you start losing it, the door kind of shuts. So for longer term campaigns, you tend to lose more people through the loss of sanity than you do, say, of losing your hit points and dying, for example. So it's a very different mechanic in terms of that game. I hear there's something similar in Savage Worlds, though. Eric, you had a bit of a hunt around and thought of something immediately.
Yeah, I did have a hunt around, and we talked a bit about how we could do this. So, up front, everybody knows about the fear system, or if you play Savage Worlds, it's one of the systems in there where if you encounter something that is some type of phobia or fear or whatever it is, you roll your spirit modified by the fear of the monster, usually a +2 or maybe up to a +4. If you fail that, then you roll on a fear table where most of the things are temporary, and then at the very end, there's a major phobia or a minor phobia hindrance that you can get, and then the heart attack is basically you can die from that, but it's a little bit hard to do that. That's the kind of base fear, but when you guys mentioned that, I immediately thought of the really, really, really old horror companion from the Adventure Edition, or not the Adventure Edition, the Explorers Edition, which actually has a sanity mechanic, which lines up pretty well, and it still works for Suede. It lines up pretty well with the Cthulhu, but we did think of a couple of tweaks. So I'll explain how that is written in the book, and then our tweaks. So basically, every character has a sanity pool, which is a derived statistic, just like parry or toughness, which is your half your spirit +2. So somebody with a D6 in spirit would have a 5 in their sanity pool. Every time somebody loses a fear roll, they automatically lose a point of sanity. And if they rolled a 1 on their fear roll, then they lose 2 points of sanity. So obviously nobody wants to roll a 1 on the spirit, but that's what would happen in that case. Once a hero with under 2 sanity has there's something weird about them. There's kind of a little quirk, and they talk about that a player should pick a minor habit, which is one of the hindrances in the book, to reflect that, and then it kind of goes away after Sanity 3, once you're above Sanity 3. The big thing is once a character hits Sanity 0, then they become genuinely deranged, and they have to roll on a psychosis table. And there's a whole table with stuff like flashbacks, which affects initiative, or fatalists, which gives you a minus to like persuasion rolls. I mean, you would just it says charisma, but in our case we would talk about persuasion, or command radius is halved. Basically it affects how they interact with people. Things like addiction, like you get the addiction hindrance. Paranoia, you would get delusional, stuff like that. So there's all this stuff where the highest one will actually kill you by you basically go so crazy that the GM takes control. And the modifier on the initial fear roll that triggered the psychosis is added to this roll. So plus 23 is the permanent psychosis that takes you out of the game. To recover sanity, which you can do, there's basically 3 ways. Once somebody triumphs over evil, they're able to attempt to recover sanity. A month of rest in like an institution or somewhere nice, they can attempt it. And the healing spell, which says automatically recovers 1 point of sanity within the golden hour, kind of like wounds, or 2 with a raise. And then greater healing restores all of them. Actual psychoses can be removed in the same way as regaining sanity, but this. I should talk. When those things happen with recovering sanity, the player has to make a smarts roll, and that's what actually determines. So after they've had their month of rest, they make a smarts roll, and if they fail, they don't recover anything. A success gives you back 1 point, and a raise gives you back 2 points. So and then going back to psychosis, to recover psychosis, the smarts roll is just done at a -4. So if you instead wanted to recover from a psychosis, you would do it at a -4. All right, that was a lot of language.
So we talked about what
did that make
Savage
sense?
Worlds
I kind
has,
of rambled.
And we had talked a little bit about what Call of Cthulhu. We talked a little bit about taking some of those elements, because they're a little bit different, right? And merging them into what you found in the Horror Companion, which is actually very good to start with. So go ahead, and I think you were taking notes on our conversation. You want to talk a little bit about how that might merge?
Yeah. I think overall we kind of all agreed that it fits pretty well. I mean, there's this, you have your normal fear rolls, and if you're in a horror game like a Cthulhu type of situation, there's going to be a lot of fear rolls going your way. So GM, for one, just make them do a lot of fear rolls. To make this system kind of more punishing than even it is, which it already is pretty punishing, I think the first thing we said is get rid of the healing spell. Being able to recover sanity, that just doesn't make any sense. So just get rid of that completely. Again, for the recovering sanity, that month of rest, James was saying how usually it's either kind of in an institution, which it talks about here, and that gives you a +2 in the Savage Worlds version, but it costs money. right? So it says typically costs about $1,000 a week, and if you're there for a month, right, that's $4,000. So if they aren't something like that, then it costs them. But he talked about how if you're not in an institution, you have to be in a place like your hometown, or a place where, I don't know, you first had your first date with your wife or something, right? Somewhere special that means something to you. And then if you fail that role,
or with someone special. So one way to recover sanity in Call of Cthulhu is you hang out at your favorite bar, or go and catch up with your cherished aunt, or take a drive in your fancy car. Do some of these things, and that's how you can recover your sanity. The issue is at the end of that period you make a roll, and if you fail that roll, then that place is a bit tainted, and it doesn't give you the kind of the rest that you need ever again. So it makes it a little bit darker and a bit more macabre.
So I think adding that in is perfect. And there's already that smarts roll at the end, and it's a smarts roll, not a spirits roll, for recovering sanity that's already in the horror system. So yeah, again, if you fail that smarts roll that you would normally roll, then that place is gone to. It's burns. Whatever you've now associated it with your phobia or whatever, you can't use it again. And then the final thing we wanted to add in here to really make it feel like Cthulhu, which it has that, like we talked about, that kind of domino effect, or the kind of falling house of cards, that kind of where it gets worse as it goes, is that when you lose sanity, how many points less of your total? So say if you had a pool of 5 and then you lost a point of sanity, upcoming fear rolls would then add on that negative. So say you have 4 out of your 5 sanity points, and there's a fear roll coming at you with a -2 because it's a horrible creature. You would actually roll fear at a -3. So you're going to get afraid that much easier. Now, we don't think you should add this onto the fear table.
Right.
So normally when you would add the same negative to the plus on the fear table, you don't need to add it there. But this makes it so you have that kind of, a stone rolling down a hill, right? Like that kind of feeling. But you should definitely cap this at a -3.
Yeah,
so basically, like, people with higher spirits aren't going to be punished more because they have larger pools. And this kind of lines up with wounds. That -3 is the highest you can kind of get. So yeah, I think those things, we didn't have to tweak much to it, but getting rid of the healing, putting the stuff in, like James said, about the month of rest, and then adding those negatives for fear rolls based on how much sanity you've already lost up to a -3, I already think should probably emulate that feeling of dread kind of building and making it easier that you're losing your mind. And it will get you to 0 sanity faster. Remember, once you get to 0 sanity is when you actually start rolling on the psychosis table. And then one more thing that James had brought up is when we were talking about it before, is that often when, like, if you recover from, psychosis, or recover from sanity, or if you, in the rules here, it says when you are at 0 and you roll again and you roll again, you keep rolling the psychosis table. And if you roll the same thing, then it becomes worse. That maybe just, if they fail a fear check and they're at 0 sanity and they already have a psychosis, then just automatically make that psychosis worse. You don't need to have, because then this could really, you could end up having like 4 extra hindrances, and that's just a little bit too cumbersome. So, they don't need to have a million things. Just make the thing that they have worse and worse, I think. So what do you guys think?
I totally agree.
Yeah, you don't want to overcomplicate. Yeah, you don't want to overcomplicate the narrative and the role play either. I can't imagine anything worse than playing someone with 4 different phobias. It would be a bit silly, but I think that's workable. Having said that, I do encourage you still to go back. Have a look at the Keeper's book to Call of Cthulhu. Have a look at some of the tables in there. There's a lot of information in Call of Cthulhu that deals with sanity mechanics. And so, there's heaps of flavour. So if you are converting it to any system, go back to the source, have a bit of a look. There's some great tables and good resources there as well.
And I think you could take stuff, like, you can look at the psychosis table here, and you could probably take stuff from those tables and just add them in to what possible roles can be, right? Like, you can take a lot of that flavor from those tables and just insert them into the psychosis table. So that would be cool too.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think that'd make a good mashup of the two systems. Would have been probably harder if we didn't already have a lot of that work done in the Horror Companion previously. So, so hopefully, Daddy Dungeon Master, that helped answer that question. Thanks again. I encourage everyone to send in questions or tweet us, whatever. Did I mention it was Game Master at masteringtherepg.com? I think I might have mentioned that, so I'll mention it again. So we're going to move right forward to the main topic.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
Hey everyone, we got the main topic now, and I think today James is going to lead us through it and take the lead there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl. Our topic today is modern gaming versus old school, or the decline of the 10-foot pole. I don't know if you gentlemen remember the days of 10-foot pole dungeoneering. Do you guys remember this?
You don't know how old I am, do you then? You must not know.
I know you know, Carl. Have you ever had to pack a 10-foot pole in a backpack in your time playing role-playing games, Eric?
I had is a strong word. We've definitely bought a 10-foot pole before in one of my games, but it was not a need. It was more of a, this is hilarious. Just kind of a fun.
What the hell's this doing on the equipment list?
Yeah.
Why?
We knew why it was there, but it was like, we don't actually need this because the system doesn't, require you to be that granular.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, today we're going to be talking about this kind of, there's an emerging argument that's probably been going on for quite a while about old school versus modern role-playing gaming. And one of the terms that we hear bandied about all the time is this thing called OSR, old school revival or old school renaissance. Carl, you're the oldest out of all of us. What the hell is OSR, or old school renaissance?
Well, OSR is really where people look back to the original D&D, old school D&D, and said, they look back and said, those were simpler times. Those were better times, whether it is or not. But there's really a couple things that make OSR. The big one that people talk about all the time is rulings over rules. So OSR games traditionally had less rules. Everything wasn't codified. Now, those who read the original Dungeon Master Guide for AD&D know that Gary liked to tell you absolutely every little detail of stuff that you could do. But we're talking the core rules were relatively simple. There weren't a lot of stats. There weren't a lot of skills. Yeah. And so the Game Master was making the rulings based on what players said they were trying to do. So that's really the second thing. Fewer rules, less complicated in general. You didn't have things like feats. You didn't have things like skills generally. Now, some OSR stuff has a little bit of skills because remember Rune Master and stuff like that had skills. And then the last thing is...
and we had things like bend bars, lift gates as well. Having said that, we had extrapolated skills.
Well, the biggest skills you had were the thief, right? Where you had a 5% chance of doing something at first level. And you rolled a percentile dice. Right. But that goes back to... Well, we'll talk a little bit of how that's changed in time. And then the last thing really is player skill versus character skill. Right? In more modern games, you have skills that are related to the character. There is a perception check you can have. In the old school, player skill was more important. You had to tell me that you were doing something. And that's where the 10-foot pole came in, right? You're walking down the dungeon and you're telling the Game Master, I'm bouncing in front of me so that I find that trap, versus some, mechanical advantage you have where you can do a passive perception check or something like that. So that's kind of the thing that drives that OSR.
We're going to get a bit more into that specific as well very shortly. So the two big things you're thinking in OSR is rules light and player skill over character skill. They're the two big standouts.
Yeah, and they usually state that as rulings over rules is how people like to say it all the time. Yeah,
okay.
Yep.
And I mean, and also character creation was much different, right? I mean, just even to the kind of rolling for stats, the methodology of that then and now, or
3d6 straight down the line. Yeah, the OSR, it's a renaissance. It doesn't say it has to do exactly the way Gary did it. So most of the systems that you run into today, they think about like 4d6 or 3d6 drop or drop lowest,
or not rolling at all.
46 drop one.
Or not even rolling at all.
Yeah, they're not all 3d6 straight down the line, as was proper in the day, to be quite honest. So, but you mentioned
as was proper, and Sorry, and in a lot of ways, this was almost competitive Dungeons and Dragons in the day. I remember a lot of adventures that were coming out. You weren't really designed to survive. This is not a time of attachment to your character. This is not a time of narrative exposure with storytelling and backstory, and not so much anyway. That was my experience in some manner. Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I think. If you think back to some of those old school adventures like White Plume Mountain and Tomb of Horrors, they're meat grinders, and that was the expectation. Is that I think even Gary back now. Remember, old school Renaissance isn't like just do what Gary did, but those old ones really were meat grinders. You don't get too attached to your character. Now, when you built characters, they were much simpler to build. So it wasn't. I spent 4 hours trying to get my character just so, and now you killed it. It was much easier to make a character back then, and so OSR.
And I guess absolutely
doesn't mean exactly that. Doesn't mean you're doing just what Gary did, but it's in that spirit.
So in the spirit of that, I guess what I'd like to do is have a bit of a look at what was. So what are some of the things that were happening in particularly fantasy role playing games then? And then how that might be different now when we're approaching this, and why that might have occurred in between. We'll talk a little bit about as well. So in my experience back in my day, as we might say, we've got characters that we're not as attached to, that are you kind of beholden to the dice in a lot of ways. They're much more simplified. We have things like hirelings and henchmen, where you would buy extra characters, extra bodies to deal with a dungeon. Everyone had a 10-foot pole to kind of poke and prod things around. You had to deal with lighting a lot more. Who's holding the torch? Where are you? They had much more intricate mapping detail. We had things like provisions, encumbrance, counting arrows, lots of that kind of stuff that probably isn't as much as modern role-playing games now. Have I missed anything? What are some of the things
specific
that
spell
you remember
components?
from?
Like specific.
Oh
spell
yeah,
components?
material components for spells. Alignment, a little bit different in terms of a codified way of doing things.
But there's nothing more exciting as a game master though was to watch your players draw the map wrong. And now they're off. It was just so funny. But anyway, yeah.
We nominated roles around the table where you nominated your mapper and you nominated your caller and you nominated your leader.
Wow.
Do you remember all of those things?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Somebody had to be responsible for saying what everybody was doing because, otherwise it'd be mayhem. People actually telling you what they were doing themselves. Come on. How crazy is that?
It was like a huddle. You'd huddle in, talk about it, and one guy would poke his head up and go, right, this is the plan. Very strange, but wonderful at the time, I guess. And so as things have gone on, a lot of that stuff, a lot of the minutiae, a lot of the detail seems to have faded. Why do you think that is?
I mean, for me, I think a big part is just getting out of the way, like to let the players role play and to let the players get to the action and also as a broader audience comes in, right? There's a lot of people who don't want to spend that much time doing that or don't have that much time. And when people get older and they have jobs, they don't have the amount of time that they did. So for me, I think a lot of it's time saving and also just appealing to a broader audience and really having role play come more to the surface, because if you spend all that time talking about, and you talked about this with player skill versus character skill, our characters are professional adventurers, right? They know how to search a hallway. You don't need to, as yourself, describe that. And if you spend that time describing everything, you don't have the time to maybe role play as much or get into combat as much. So at least how that's I see it. And I think it also kind of lines up interestingly a lot with video games, especially video game RPGs. I mean, you look at the first RPG video games, right? They were text-based. And the whole game was you literally had to type, I'm doing this. I look for this. And that was what the game was, reactive. And then as technology has gotten more sophisticated, all of that is simulated around. You don't have to worry about any of that. And a lot of these, computer role-playing games, there is just a search or a stealth button that you click, and then our character just does that. And so I think people grow up playing those games, and that's what they kind of want to expect in their role-playing games too. Of why would I need to be so specific? At least that's how I see it.
Why should I count my arrows? Is it surely there's a counter for that kind of vibe? Or more importantly, who wants to spend their time keeping track of arrows? Let's just assume my guy's clever enough and bought enough arrows for the weekend, shall we? And just be done with it. Yeah.
And searched under the rug and looked in this drawer and this drawer. I don't need to say each drawer that I looked in or whatever, right? So
and I think there was a lot of those old games. There was a lot of sort of things built on top of. Sort of a house of cards when we talk about definitely the older ones there. It goes against this whole less rules, easier. But as somebody wanted to add something in, it just was a pile of mash. It's like, okay, well, for initiative, we're using D6. Well, for this, we're going to use a D20. But now for thief checks, it's a it's a D100. And now, this thing might have a skill. Well, then we'll just throw the skill on. What's changed, I think, is people got tired a little bit of that inconsistency and just how difficult. The revival, though, a lot of those folks have fixed that. So OSR fixes a lot of those issues. But I think as we move into modern games, it's just a different feel people are looking for. Like you said, they want to role play more. They want consistency. They don't want to have to figure everything out 5 different ways. They want to feel like they're professional adventurers, I guess, have role play things and have more choices that they can make. In the old school, a fighter's a fighter's a fighter. And what makes them different is how you describe what you're doing as a swashbuckler versus a barbarian. In more modern games, they've codified that to allow people to experience that in a more, I'm going to say realistic, that's probably the wrong term, but a more visceral way than you could maybe with the older way of looking at things.
I guess that the evolution of games and role-playing games in particular, people are hearkening back to a simpler time. Well, the simpler time was just before people got to it and added rules to it in a lot of ways. If I look back on even second edition Dungeons and Dragons and the huge amount of rules that emerged out of just that second edition with kit books and different racial stuff, and the whole book's just exploded in that scene in a relatively short period of time, 4 or 5 years, just really dumping that out and adding all those more rules. 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder have both been touted as ways of the simplification and going back to less rules, but OSR is even simpler than this, isn't it? It's even simpler than 5th Ed.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of OSR games you can look at. There's tons of them. There's DX, there's... suddenly they're escaping me, but each one is what they're trying to do is keep it simple. And a lot of these games where they strip all the garbage out, all the strangeness that was in the games back then, they're not that long. Some of those books are 100 pages of things, and they add in some interesting elements as well, but they're not complicated. And I think that's what people who are going back to that, they want to kind of experience more, I'm house ruling it and I'm making those rulings and I don't have to worry about, all the different things that you'd worry about in a modern game, which has its own benefits.
Very much so. So, there must be an appeal there in terms of why people are playing OSR more than and others. And I must admit, I've got a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for? I've got fond memories of playing a lot of these grittier games. Yeah, there's a big nostalgia. Oh, yeah. How do you guys sit about where you play? Like in your ideal game, and I say I run games for a lot of younger people, so this is not a thing at all. But where do you guys sit in terms of realistic grittiness or that kind of that old school nostalgia in these games? Is it there at all, Carl? Maybe not for Eric.
I would completely. I've been looking at a lot of OSR games that fix a lot of problems with like AD&D First Edition. I would totally play and run an OSR game based on one of these rule sets, and there's like many of them. I'd have to pick the one because it just would be fun to just have people say, well, I'm a fighter, but if I'm a fighter in this way, I'm just going to describe it and I'm going to kind of role play it out because it's not meat grinder like it used to. People now understand what role playing is, And so even applying OSR, they're going to role play it. Now and then you can get rid of like, okay, I won't make you look under the table because we don't do that anymore. I'll just roll your smarts and call it good, and we'll see if you found what.
Yeah.
So you can take what people have learned in the 40 years that makes a game interesting, and you can apply it to these simplified rules that harken back to the original role-playing games. I think I would totally run an OSR game for sure, but I would use what we know now and not try to run it like I would back then. No, they don't have to map. No, you won't have to map. Don't worry about it.
I noticed that. Eric, how about you? Would you dip your toe in an OSR? In terms of simplified stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I haven't really played a lot of the older games like you guys have. The one thing that I think of as far as old and new or old and updated is like I've played Traveler, which I hated. This is me coming from a modern version. Just hated Traveler. I hated the character creation. But I also have played Stars Without Number, which was supposed to be the kind of, revived Traveler. And that was almost the opposite. I mean, Traveler has a ton of weird rules, has crazy character creation. Stars Without Number kind of tightened that up, although there was still old school stuff in there. Like you still rolled the straight 3d6s, but you didn't have to worry about, describing everything. But for me, when you guys talk about this, I think of the more narrative games and how those, the problem with these, you talk about OSR and all this stuff, it's like they're still kind of D20. They still have these roots in miniature gaming, right? In wargaming. If you want to play with simplified rules, like for me, I love playing what's it called? Dungeon, what's like Monster Hearts, and I'm just totally spacing out right now. Apocalypse Engine games.
Yeah,
Apocalypse Engine games, right? It's a very narrative game. There's really simple attributes. You have like kind of simple kind of moves. It's mostly narrative, right? You could, like you said, you kind of describe how you do it. So to me, that's where I would go, is to those type of narrative games, and I love those type of games. And they don't have their roots though in that war gaming, so there isn't that conflict. I mean, to me, I see a lot of these updated, but we're still using D20, D&D stuff, but we have less rules. But then, for me, like Pathfinder 2e, which it did really well, is compared to 5e, which some people like and don't like, is that 2e, while it has stuff like, has rules for all these things, like how do you break down something, or it has all these kind of specific rules. You don't have to wonder like you do in 5e. And yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I looked at stuff like Apocalypse Engine or Fate,
simpler
Cortex.
system.
Yeah.
Yep.
I would just say that the character creation in Traveler is the one thing that a lot of people like. So that's funny that you don't. That's the one thing you hated. A lot of people love that. I love system.
Yeah, I guess it's good to not have that control sometimes. I'm just like, I want to have control over my character. Maybe some stuff, right? Like some roles, but that when it's completely random, like that's not. When it's interesting, I wouldn't like to play that over and over agaand that's just not how I like to do it. So,
dying in character creation can be a weird feeling, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this might be a little bit tangential, unrelated. But one thing that I hear a lot about is the decline in the game of the exploration pillar of role-playing games. So if we think about your three pillars being role-playing, combat, and exploration, a lot of what we're talking about here is in some ways the removal of that exploration issue. If I look at dungeoneering, but not just dungeoneering, but any kind of protracted campaigning.
Yeah.
Keeping track of your food, understanding if you've got tents, understanding how you move a group through the day, keeping track of arrows, keeping track of material components, is that gritty realism of the exploration phase. And I'm interested in you guys. I miss that a bit. I miss the idea of characters understanding that we had verbal and somatic and material components in spells and how that worked, and the ranger understanding how many days food you've got left, or whether we've got tents and shelter and things like that. Keeping track of that stuff. Is there any part that can play anymore? Or do you think that kind of grittiness is also declining?
Well, honestly, I don't think it is, because for certain genres, I mean, there's a lot of games that are post-apocalypse, for example, and that's all about resource management and you don't have enough bullets for your gun. So there are tracking, but in the fantasy world where, why do we care how many arrows are in your quiver? I guess that is somewhere But genres out there still have that. And if you still enjoy sort of that fear of, am I going to die tomorrow because I starved to death? There's genres to go play. High fantasy, not so much, right? But there are genres out there that you can go do that.
I found it interesting. I tried to bring it into a Curse of Strahd game last year, and the players just really reacted poorly to it, saying, "Oh, no, we don't like this. We don't like not having enough food to live throughout the night." It's like, well, anyway. Sorry, Eric, I interrupted.
No, I mean, I have literally played a lot of games where that's a phase of the game, and you do, and some of the systems provide that. I mean, Pathfinder 2e, they broke their systems down into encounters, exploration, and downtime. And so the exploration, which I think they did excellent, it's narrative. It's more narrative. So you still have, like, you say what you're doing, there's a specific list of exploration actions, and you kind of say what action you want to do. Some of the things could be searching or hiding or, making recall knowledge checks. And there's kind of an automatic, just one roll. So you don't have to say, it's not like you're going through this every step in the way. And then there is systems for rations, but it's not so specific, right? A lot of times, again, I think there's a balancing act between how actual, simulationist you want to get, how gritty you want to get, as far as, okay, well, you need water and food, right? You need to have food. Water's you can't go more than 3 days, and food you can't go more than this. And then, what about extra screws for your thing? All of that is like, while it's cool, like, it just bogs down gameplay so much. So I think you can still achieve that through how the GM plays it, and maybe having, like, you just have rations. Those are food, those are water, those are, like, supplies, right? I think you can kind of make it more intuitive, make it more kind of like how in the board gaming world, right, we have these American games with tons and tons of rules, and then the European games came in with kind of these, like, quick, elegant mechanics that kind of summed it up. And then there was a marriage of the two, and that's the marriage is where I love. You can have both. You can have that feeling of, okay, we are getting hungry and we need to go. Like, I played a Pathfinder game where the guy used hexes, and we only had a certain amount of we could move on the hex. And then if we spent too much time, then we couldn't roll to hunt, basically. And then so our ration pool was going down. But we didn't have to be so granular about, like, okay, well, we have berries and protein and whatever, look for water, all that stuff, right? So I think there is a balancing act. I think there is my main.
Yeah,
point.
I think I'm the same. I think I'm not quite at the roll for mixed diet. Make sure that
you need fat, right? You can't just eat moose, right? You would die from not having fat or whatever. Yeah,
I don't know if nutritionally balanced is a check mark on this.
What if your character concept is a vegan? Well, I don't know. Now you have to worry about that, don't you, in the game? No, I'm just joking. So.
That would be an interesting thing to consider. Like, you have to eat so many nuts, and constantly you're bothering everybody for nuts. But
you're foraging forever. 80% of your day is forage.
So I do think some systems provide that. Whether your players didn't like it at all, it seems more like they just didn't like the exploration survival thing at all. That's not what they were signing up for, right? Because it wasn't. Yeah. Just going hungry. They were like, I don't like that. So you definitely have to have the right group, or you're buying into the game, saying there is an exploration part to this, or you are going to have this kind of, like, tracking resources. So it's all about the buy-in for the game, I think.
And it's funny. It's this, in some ways, the change has accelerated as well. This is a relatively recent thing. I found I ran Hidden Shrine of Tamawachan a couple of years ago to a group and that game was never designed to be finished. Like, you weren't supposed to survive it. Okay. The point of the game was, which room did you get to before you died? And so the traps were more and more merciless. They were more and more ridiculous as you went on, and designed for a convention setting. Wizards of the Coast published it as an anthology in just a normal game book, and so I whipped it out thinking this will be fun, and having no idea of the sheer deadliness. And in some ways, I missed that a little bit, the sheer deadliness of dungeons and how ridiculous some of them were. And I do harken back a little bit to this idea of competitive conventions, where you'd get a group of your 5 savviest and when we say adventurers, 5 savviest players who had good experience in playing the game, to try and beat the unbeatable dungeon in either quicker or less death or less turns or something like that. Carl, you do the cons. I'm off to one next week, but could you ever see that happening again? A competitive convention dungeon?
I don't. Right now, the competitive. There's not really competitive, right? There's like Adventure League and stuff, which is somewhat competitive, but everybody assumes that they're going to be successful.
Really.
And then there's how successful you are, and then you're growing your character, and you have this living world kind of thing going on. I don't know. I could see it. I know there's people who run things like Tomb of Horror at conventions just for the grins and enjoying it. But I totally would see that as being a fun thing to do if you had that's something maybe I should do. I don't know. I mean, I love running events, so maybe we get, that way I could run like 12 people through it, get a bunch of tables and see how far each team can get before they die. Not Tomb of Horrors, though. That's like the worst adventure ever designed.
No,
but
Tomb of Horrors is a whole other thing. And it's inspiring me a bit. I'm going, why don't I run just like a gritty, hardcore dungeon where... And in some ways, when I'm running Call of Cthulhu, and bizarrely, the whole premise of this Call of Cthulhu game I'm running in a week or so at this con is you only have 3 candles, and when your candles are out, there is no more light, and therefore horror, death, that kind of thing. So it's interesting. There's certainly a place for grittiness, and certainly a place for resource management, isn't there? As a player in these games, if this is something that you're kind of keen on doing, what are some of the ways that you might add some realism to your game? I know, Eric, when we play it a lot, your artifice is fantastic. You are very specific about the things that you try and create, and your inventory is expansive. Is that something that so there is detail there when you want there to be? It's interesting
and that's my
in
character.
terms of the realistic...
And that's my character, and we have a lot of fun kind of... when I want to build something that's crazy, I've kind of paid the price mostly in role playing that I've done these things before and gathered resources. So now you're going to let me like do something crazy, right? Because I've kind of paid that toll. I've put in the work, as it were.
Put in the narrative. Yeah. You've
put in the narrative.
Started the story.
Yeah. But as far as adding grittiness as a player, I mean, again, I really think it's all about the buy-in, man. I mean, you guys talk about, like, I think there is totally a space for a kind of competitive dungeon. If that's what people are signing up to do, you're like, this is the competition. I think a lot of people would be down to do that. And like you said, Carl, there is, even in D&D, there is the Tomb of Horror or whatever, Abomination Vaults, or I can't remember all the different names, but there is that, like, brutal dungeons, and how far can you get? I think the problem with a lot of those games is that the GM, if they want to, they can just kill you. You know what I mean? So you need a very structured, repeatable thing to do that. I don't know.
And in some ways, that brings us to the actual point. A lot of the original dungeons had, here is the trap. Here's a picture of the trap.
Yeah.
Here are the conditions in which the trap will kill you, and here are the conditions in which the trap will allow you out. And then it was up to the players to push, turn, pull, spin, rotate, extract, whatever word that they could think of, because that was the magic word in the description of the room that got you out of the trap, which is why we started this in the first place.
Oh my God, box text that you had to listen to exactly as read that was telling you some little clue. I mean, come on, this is the puzzles of the box text was crazy in some of those old adventures. If you didn't hear the right word where they said something a certain way, then you're dead in the water. You missed something. You missed the fact that there was something there. That's crazy. I would not run an old game that way. Just because, again, we've learned 40 years worth of knowledge, right? So.
So I just want to pile up with on, James, to what you said about players adding grittiness in with their characters and kind of introducing this, that you keep it where it's very general, right? The characters can search. They just say, I'm searching. So it's not like you don't apply negatives to them for not looking for specific things, but if they do put in the work or do mention specific things, then you reward them. And that could be a way to incentivize players to actually then be kind of play in that more gritty, realistic way. So we're never like taking away from players from not being so specific maybe, but you reward them. Like you've maybe rewarded me for allowing me to do stuff, or you give them a bonus on their roll because they said specifically this thing, or, like I have a hunter character in a different game that tracks what monsters he's killed to try to get bonuses. So I think maybe that's the kind of way to go, to, at least for players who are new or, don't have those old school roots, is to reward them for maybe playing that grittier way, but don't give them penalties if they don't, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this always, as we always say, goes back to communication at the start of the campaign about where your settings are in terms of the game. You know, I must admit, just this chat alone, I'm starting to think, I wouldn't mind just pulling out the old second edition rule books and you know, get some more pit traps in the game and hire a henchling or two to kind of push in front of me with a 10-foot pole to illuminate the space. There is something certainly nostalgic about it.
Your torchbearer who hits the pit first. That's their job as torchbearers.
Yeah.
Hit the pit first.
and you would go into town and go, I've got 12 copper. I need 6 guys. Who's going to come and walk in front of me? Oh dear, very good. Any other thoughts, gents, on OSR? There's certainly it's an increasing in appeal, but I'm wondering if it's increasing for a very specific demographic, of which two of three of us are probably sitting in the same room.
I think
see
people are
it
interested.
growing?
Yeah, I think, as you know, just like there's, you know, most people, they're playing D&D 5e, right? That's where most people are. That's the gateway game at this point in time. That's the main gateway game. But I think people, as they play, they see, oh, there's other types of games out there, and that could be, you know, whatever, more mechanical games, more narrative games, and there's this OSR games that people are attracted to. I mean, the Stars Without Numbers, which I don't know if you guys could consider that a revival game or not, but that had like a pretty good draw of people new to tabletop games that were like interested in it, and so I think there's definitely is a space for that, and you know, I think it's up to if you are into those type of games, maybe, you know, saying, hey, I want to run a one shot. If you guys are interested, maybe to give the GM a break, like, and then maybe, you know, do it as a one shot and see how they like it, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a big desire, and I hear it a lot, you know, in different podcasts and stuff. Rules light. There is a huge desire for people now to go for rules light games, and that goes all the way from the one-page RPG to OSR. Some OSR game systems can play in that rules light world because of the simplification and all that sort of things. And rules light is something that
the Mork board I played the other day, and it is so simple. The simplified systems are really appealing.
Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Sorry, Carl, continue.
No, I think the bottom line is that your question was, will people who are playing D&D and sort of these more modern games, will any of that appeal to them? I think it will if they come to it as a rules light alternative. If they're looking for something less, you know, heavy, then, you know, honestly, let's, you know, these modern games, some of them have got big books, right? And there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of
big
nuances,
libraries.
and, you know.
Yeah. But then is the revival, it's bringing the rules light, but is it also bringing like the 10-foot pole? Like, or is it kind of like it's rules light and, you know, you don't have to say I'm searching every single cubic, you know, meter or whatever for a trap.
And I think that goes to us as game masters learning over 30, 40 years, right? So
yeah,
the way things were played back then was because nobody knew any better, right? You mapped the dungeon because, you know, you had to map the dungeon. Otherwise, how would you know to get out? Now we'd say, well, I mean, like you said, people are smart enough. They're probably drawing a map to get out. So why would we waste our time with that piece of it? Doesn't matter if you're playing OSR or you're not playing OSR. It's just something you wouldn't do necessarily now, unless that's what you want, right? You want to have the full experience. But if you wanted to learn from those 40 years, yeah, you could. I mean, you don't have, somebody could say they're searching a room and you make that roll against, you know, intelligence or whatever it is that you think makes sense, and then just let them know what happens. And to your point, Eric, maybe you give them a bonus if they do say, I'm going to look under the bed and search behind the curtains. And you go, oh yeah, that's where it is behind the curtains. You found it. You don't even need to roll for it. You found it. And then you give that benefit of all the stuff we've learned over many, many decades of gaming, while still being able to leverage that cool rulings versus rules. You know, player skill isn't as big a deal anymore, but, you know, they can be clever still. It's cool. I think OSR has got a lot of ability to do better than it did in the old days, as kind of a rules light simplification. Yep.
So I guess my final question then is, given everything that we've talked about, and we're probably going to reward characters over players in some ways, and simplifying the rule set, what would be your number one use for a 10-foot pole now? because there's still an equipment list. You can still buy one.
I mean, 10-foot pole, they're still good to trigger a trap. If you don't have Mage Hand or something, right? They're still good for that, or to search for something from far away. I mean, it's still an exploration tool that's good. When you're encountering, if you say, I'm searching the dungeon, and the DM's like, okay, roll your perception roll. And that's just kind of your roll for this segment of the dungeon. And then your GM's like, well, you encounter this weird idol or something, or this weird, like, here's a sack of gold coins. The 10-foot pole would still be good to then, okay, I bought this item, right? And I use it to poke the coin purse off, or I use it to search around. So I think there still is ways to interact with those specific things. It's just not making you, use it every second.
Carl, got an interesting use for a 10-foot pole?
Well, obviously, when you have a dungeon that has a pit, you want to be able to pole vault over the pit. So that's where you're. But this time, you'd have to bring your 30-foot pole with you for something like that.
To get over it, yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it's still the perfect width of a dungeon hallway. So 10-foot by 10-foot room, it's very easy. So when I am mapping it out, I get to use my pole to kind of touch from the walls.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, gentlemen. I think I've digressed a lot from the topic. It went from OSR, 10-foot poles, gritty realism. I think we've taken nostalgia down memory lane. We've still got a little bit of time, though. Has anyone got any final thoughts?
Well, for me, I think OSR is the spirit of the old games, but the takeaway is, even though the old games had certain things about them, like rulings over rules, whatever, we can learn from all of our experience, leverage those rules. There's a lot of games that kind of fix the THACO problem and things like that, but you can still have a really fun game leveraging those simple rules today. And I'd say try it out. There's a lot of versions of it. There's a ton of different OSR stuff out there.
I couldn't agree more. And for me, I guess my takeaway has been, if you're after a more gritty, old school style game, just get it up front, talk to your players about it, and then have fun. And I'm not lying. This chat, I'm going to go and design a death dungeon that you can't get out of, and we'll see. I might take you guys through as my first competitive guinea pigs.
All right.
All right, so that sounds like we hit that one good. Lots of good information there. So, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com, learn about our projects, other things we're doing, support us, email us, all that good stuff. Speaking of email, we got gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. So if you got a question, need some advice, again, Eric is looking for an opportunity to adjudicate differences of opinion. So please give us something to do that. And of course, there's the Twitter feed. And again, we thank Daddy Dungeon Master for throwing some questions our way. So once again, I'm Carl with Eric and James. Have a great night.
Goodbye.